Hello and welcome to the ALCTS webinar, Special Collections Cataloging Manuscripts. This is a companion session to last week's webinar, Special Collections Cataloging for Monographs. I'm Lisa Lorenzo, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Heather Perez. Heather is the Special Collections Librarian at Stockton University in Galloway, New Jersey. As a loan arranger, she oversees all operations of the collections, including acquisitions, processing, cataloging, and reference. An archivist for 12 years, previously she worked at a public library in the local history room. She brings much expertise to today's topic, and we are really excited to have her with us today. So briefly, a few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for our presenter, please type them into the question box on your screen. We will have time for Q&A after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now, here is Heather. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Okay. Hi, everyone. How are you doing today? I hope that everyone's having a great Halloween this fall day. Here in South Jersey, we're having a good day too. I'm excited to be here today with you to talk about manuscripts cataloging. As Lisa mentioned, I've been doing this for about 12 years, and all of that time I have been a loan arranger. In the archives world, we use that term to talk about an archivist who is the sole professional in that field in the library. So previously I was at the public library. I've been here at the academic library at Stockton in South Jersey for about a year now. So to tell you a little bit about what we do here, Special Collections is part of the Technical Services Department here at Stockton. And so as such, I'm lucky to be able to work closely with a cataloger. Our cataloger does our Monographs cataloging, and you hopefully learned a little bit about cataloging and Monographs last week with Melissa. And then I do most of the manuscripts cataloging, which is what we'll be talking about today. But enough about me. I'd like to know a little bit about what you are doing and what your institution is doing right now. If we could bring up at the poll, I'd like to get kind of a sense of what everyone, or where you are right now with your manuscripts cataloging. I know we don't have all of the answers for all of the job responsibilities here, but if you could just give me a sense of what you're doing right now. Okay. All right, are we able to share the results? Do we think we have enough responses? Okay. All right, I'm not able to see the results. Am I able to get those, Lisa?
Oh, sure. Let me jump in then. So it's for the first option, cataloger, already cataloging manuscripts, we have 21%. Cataloger not currently cataloging manuscripts is at 57. Archivist already cataloging manuscripts is at 14. And archivist not currently cataloging manuscripts, 19. And administrator is 5.
All right. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay. So thank you. That gives us a good sense of where we are right now, and hopefully we can help you out a little bit with going forward with some more cataloging responsibilities for manuscripts. So today, some of the things that we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about some general principles of archives, the terminology and things like that. I'll talk a little bit about the process of processing itself, and then a little bit about, a lot more about description. We'll talk about cataloging, we'll talk about finding aids, we'll talk about better cataloging, and that's where we'll go from here. So when I use the word archives or manuscripts, I use them kind of interchangeably in this webinar. What I really mean are groupings of materials that are treated together as a collection. These are usually unpublished materials. These can be things from your institution or from other institutions. They can include things that are locally published or institutionally distributed, or even born digital materials. They can also include some of the more traditional things that we may think of when we say art manuscripts, things like photograph collections or actual manuscripts of ancient and older records, and or things like scrapbooks, AV materials. Any wide variety of things can be included in archives and manuscripts collections. Now, one of the differences between how archivists operate and how librarians may think about their collections is that we consider these things in groupings. We don't necessarily think about the individual items or the monographs when we're talking about these collections. The overall collection is what we want to capture in a catalog record, not these individual items. Of course, there are exceptions to that, just like anything within our worlds. You may be thinking about, oh, but what about this important report or this unique material that we want to make sure people have access to? Sure, by all means, if it's something that important, if it's something institutionally important, or if it's something that's valuable to a researcher to have an individual record for it, by all means, go right ahead with that individual item level record. But because of the quantity of materials we may be talking about here, we probably aren't going to be able to catalog our archives collections on the individual record, and it's probably not advisable that we do. So when we talk about our manuscripts collections, we're grouping them usually by the donor or the provenance. That's how you usually, in the archives world, arrange your collections. The donor has given you a collection of materials. It could be one topic or many different topics, but you would catalog it together and consider it together as one collection. The life cycle of a collection coming into the archives here. First, the collections are usually appraised by the archivist or somebody working with them. And you go through the process of deciding if you're going to accept the collection into your repository. Most of the time, an archivist will take some notes, correspond back and forth with the donor, visit to the collection. Those kinds of things go on at that stage. The next stage, if the collection is considered is going to be accepted for the repository, you would go to the legal document stage, either a bill of sale if the collection is being purchased, or you would have a deed of gift that would help you and that would spell out the rules and restrictions, or if there are any, on the collection itself. Once the collection actually gets into the repository, you reach the accessioning stage. Maybe there's some information that's gathered about the collection. It's usually assigned a collection number or assigned an accessioning number. Things like that go on at this stage. And then at that point, many collections will get a basic inventory. Other collections may sit on a shelf for a little while longer. And all of this information, or all of these stages, generate information that are useful for our cataloging records. And I'll point that out in just a second. So when we do a rough inventory or a basic inventory, we're capturing information about the collection as a whole. And these are the kinds of things that all of these kinds of informations can go into an archival management system if you have one. For example, something like archive space or other types of things that other types of content management systems. Currently at Stockton, we don't use one of those. We use a good old Excel sheet to capture our information for this, and paper records of the same. So I'd like to find out, you've brought this collection in, you've done this basic inventory, and you have it sitting on your shelves. What do you do with it next? I'm curious to know. Let's bring up the poll. At what point does your institution create that collection level catalog record? So let's take a look at the poll and find out. We'll wait a few seconds for everyone to respond. Okay. All right, Lisa, are you able to share those results?
Just a minute once it switches. Okay, so we have when the collection is first received, we have 10%. After a basic inventory is completed, 3%. After the collection is fully processed or organized, 7%. And then after the finding aid is complete, 52%. And my institution doesn't create a collection level record at 28%.
Thank you. Okay, great. So it looks like a lot of us are waiting until after the collection is fully processed to do those records, and then some of us are not at this point to do the records yet. Well, one of the things that I have gone back and forth about, and of course this is an institutional decision, is whether or not to put that record up right away, right? To think about, well, you know, it's not fully processed, but I'd like to have people know that we have it, that kind of a question. From the March 2009 ARL report, Special Collections in ARL Libraries, the recommendation is that we include at least a brief catalog entry for every collection. So there certainly is an argument to be made for creating that basic bibliographic entry record right now as collection first comes in. I'm at a state institution. We like to keep things fairly open, of course. And so I've decided that we are going to start putting up those MARC records, those collection catalog records at the very start. At least this way I can let people know what we have. If I am getting any questions about it, I can, you know, correspond with the researcher, talk with the researcher about if they can have access to it and at what point we can have access and about how much time it might take for them to be able to have access to that collection. But it gives the sense of what you have. And as many of us archivists will tell you, we have a backlog for the most part with our processing. Shelves are full, not as much on the record though. And so depending on that backlog, the administrative support that you have, your staffing levels, student interest in a particular collection, your collection may just sit there for years before it's fully processed and ready to be described. Depending on your institution's policy, some archives do make unprocessed collections available for research, and I can show you how to put in a note in your records indicating that it's unprocessed and may have some restrictions on its use. Having that basic bibliographic entry, that basic catalog entry, allows for that access, but it also promotes transparency and gives an accurate picture of what your institution has. Now, other options that might exist also, maybe you just list the collection name in a listing of collections on a website, just so people at least have that title level access to the collection. Or you could include a local entry in your online catalog and not do an entry, for example, in OCLC that would be visible worldwide. Maybe you just include it at a local level. But presuming that you do want to create a catalog record for your collections level, a MARC record or the like, whether it's unprocessed or fully processed, we're going to look at a little bit about how we can do that now. First, let's talk about some of the standards that we use for describing manuscripts for cataloging manuscript collections. The Society of American Archivists uses DACS, Describing Archives, a Content Standard. The most recent version of this is available online through the Society of American Archivists website. And this does replace the older Archives, Personal Papers, and Manuscript standards. Now, we also use MARC, the catalog records that we'll talk some about today, to create collection level entries. Describing Archives, a Content Standard, the DACS, that is more guidelines for how to create your finding aids. And DACS is RDA neutral. The Society of American Archivists has not come out in favor or against RDA, as it were. And then another standard that's used for manuscripts in description is called Encoded Archival Description, EAD. And this is a way of marking up your finding aids to include online so that your catalog is able, or your search engines are able to find your finding aids based on the tags that you've assigned to them. We won't be talking much about that today. I just mention it because it is a standard for describing manuscript collections. So talking about where are you going to get your information from for your catalog records? There's several different sources of information that you can rely on. Ideally, if you're a cataloger, you're collaborating with the archivist that, on these types of on the catalog record and on the types of information that you might need. If you're the archivist also doing the cataloging, well, you're in luck because you've got access to everything you hopefully might need for that. Where does the information come from to create our basic bibliographic entry? Several of the things that we might consider would be those appraisal notes that I mentioned earlier on. These are things like the discussions with the donors, the information about the collection. You know, when the donor is pointing out to you highlights of the collection or mentioning to you important items. For example, also if a monetary appraisal was actually done about the collection or by the donor about the collection, this would also include important information that you could use for your catalog record. Obviously not the monetary value itself, but the information that's being gathered by an appraiser, professional appraiser about the monetary value would help with that. Another source of information are those accession records. The collection is here in the building, you're assigning it a number, you're looking through it to grab some of that information and to record that accession number. Also, the deed of gift. It may include a rough inventory, either by the donor or the archivist itself as part of that legal document. And it would include things perhaps like the dates of the collection, the overall dates, and a broad description of what the contents are, as well as any restrictions on access that the donor has placed on the collection. And then that next step, the basic inventory. This is your first look in the boxes, in some of the folders, and it would include, ideally, some of the things that you may want to include in a basic catalog record. Say things as well about access restrictions would be recorded in a basic inventory. Things that we include in a basic inventory would be, if there's sources of personal information, if there's problems with preservation of the collection, those are the types of things that are included in a basic inventory that would also help in a catalog record to determine if that collection can be opened for access or not. I keep all of these records that I've just mentioned in what I call my administrative files, my collection files. These are not files that are available to the public because of the types of information in them, but they are great resources for staff to use, and particularly in this case for catalogers. Let's take a look at how to create that basic bibliographic entry now. I'm going to be showing you a series of tables here, but I do want to mention that I have a handout that I'll be sending out after the workshop here with some of this information on it. And so hopefully, if you're not able to jot them down right now, you'll be able to use the handout to get that information. And so that'll be coming out after the webinar today. So looking at the basic bibliographic entry for our MARC fields, at our MARC fields here, we're going to look at the fixed fields first. Some of the things that are unique or that are that I want to point out about MARC entries for manuscript collections. Under the leader 8, or the fixed field 8 here, the type of control would be archival. From the Library of Congress description of this, it says that material is described according to archival descriptive rules, which focus on the contextual relationships between items and their provenance rather than on bibliographic details. So talking about the items as a collection as a whole. Once you've used that fixed field A or 8 value A, you would specify in subfield you would specify in field E40 subfield E. Sorry about that. You would specify the type of archival control that you're using. DAX, RDA combination there. Under fixed field 17, the encoding level, this is where you would indicate that we are doing a basic bibliographic entry, that we're doing our initial bibliographic entry here. You would use an encoding level K for OCLC participants, and this is telling us as we look at the entry that it is not a full entry, that eventually it may be updated. Ideally, it will be updated, right? And then under fixed field 8, the dates, this is also an important field for archives because this is where you can include things like the bulk dates of a collection, where you can include the inclusive dates. You can mention, any of the dates that you've run across in that initial look through the collection. If it's known, of course. Now, of course, in archives collections, sometimes dates are unknown or the inventory didn't pick them up, and of course you can specify that also in fixed field 8. Looking at some of the variable fields for the collections, I'm combining here some of the requirements from RDA, or I'm looking at the requirements for DAX here, and that's where I'm pulling the basic bibliographic entry information from for a basic entry for an archives collection. So looking at some of these fields, you would want to include things like the creator, who put the collection together or who is the collection from. Not necessarily the donor of the collection, it just depends on the collection itself. For example, in this case, I've chosen to use a collection that was by one of our Stockton University founding mothers, Elizabeth Alton. And she had a collection of papers and things. She was on our original board of trustees, and she was also responsible for getting the university placed here in southern New Jersey. So Elizabeth Alton had gathered up her materials and she donated them to the library. And so in this case, the creator and the compiler, the collector, are all the same, Alton, Elizabeth Barstow. And we named the papers after her, the Elizabeth Alton Papers. Now in the archives world, we use several designations for the titles of collections. Papers would be the personal collecting of papers, of materials, not necessarily papers, but papers, photographs, correspondence, scrapbooks, all of those kinds of things fall under the umbrella of papers in this instance. Records, we can call something the university records or the records of the academic affairs office because they are the official dealings of an office. So that would be the title of a records group. And then collections are usually artificial in nature. Somebody has collected all of their papers having to do with, or all of their materials having to do with a certain topic. So for example, the Miss America collections are things that one person has gathered together all on the same topic. So those would be collections versus papers versus records in our title development for this particular manuscript collection. Now, as we look at RDA versus DAX, depending on what your institution has chosen to do with your manuscript collections, this is where we differ a little bit, because the 264 field would be used if we're using an RDA philosophy or an RDA following the RDA format. However, 260 would be used if we're looking at DAX. In this case, I've chosen to show RDA and the date of production, publication, distribution, manufacture, or copyright. And this is, of course, where you would include things like the dates. And in archives, we do typically use inclusive dates, but we also try to specify bulk dates if there is a difference. So for example, in the Elizabeth Alton collection, the collection dates may be from 1906 to 2006. However, the bulk of the collection is from the 60s to the 90s. So as you can see in one of the examples here, we've specified that the 264 field would read that it's from 1906 to 2006. However, the bulk of the collection is 1963 to 1990. Under the physical description, you can include all kinds of entries here. In archives, we like to measure things in number of boxes as well as in the number of linear feet or cubic feet, depending on your institution's preference. And so we would indicate that here. And these are really designed to help your researchers to know how much they might be, that might be confronting them once they come to do the research. So we like to include as much specificity as we can on a general level. So 2 boxes, about 4 linear feet, 500 photographs, 329 digital files. Those are all the kinds of things that could be included in a 300 field. And then, of course, with RDA, we bring in things like the content type, the media type, and the carrier type. And this is different from the original DAX format for manuscripts. In RDA, we talk about things like the carriers and the media and that kind of thing. And we include those in our MARC records also. So for example, here in the Elizabeth Alton collection, we could include that there's text, we can include that there's still images, and I can include also that there is some computer material also. And all of these kinds of things end up in our catalog record. For the rest of this basic bibliographic entry, some of the other things we would want to consider would be access restrictions, whether or not they are there. And here's some language that you can use. For example, if you have decided to include a basic bibliographic catalog entry in your collection, you can indicate that the collection is not yet processed, it's restricted. Please consult the Special Collections Librarian for access. You can include things such as the collection is unrestricted but must be used in the reading room. This is also where you can include things, mentioning like the collection is stored off-site and requires 1 week's notice for access. Those are all of the types of things that should be included in a 506 field for access restrictions. Now, to the extent that you're able to, you can include a 520 summary field, and this is what we in the archives world know as our scope and content note. Maybe just a very brief statement about what's in the collection. So things, an example here, correspondence, news clippings, scrapbooks, and other items related to Alton's campaign to establish a college in southern New Jersey. This is just, a very basic overview of what a researcher might see when they open the boxes. The 546 language field in the United States, we generally don't use it unless the materials are not in English. However, you're certainly welcome to indicate that the materials are in English, and certainly please do if they are not in English. And then you would want to include your repository information so that people know where to find the collection, especially if you are publishing your basic catalog record on a site like OCLC. So let's take a look at what this might look like in the catalog. I have here a basic bibliographic record that I'm going to be showing you. And this is from OCLC, but I can show it to you in our catalog also. You'll see that it's got the K designation for the minimal record level. And you'll see that it does have a couple subject headings. Now that's not required in RDA or in DAX, I'm sorry. It's not required that we include as subject headings in the basic bibliographic record. However, our local practice is that we do include those subject headings in a basic bibliographic record, and then we can go back and update and add to them at a later point. Let's look at what it would look like in the catalog. Okay, so you can see here that this is an unprocessed collection. There is a preliminary finding aid available. Basically, it's just an inventory that we have, and it does ask people to consult the Special Collections office here if they want to have access to that. It does tell you, though, that the collection is open for research, even though it is unprocessed. And it gives you a basic scope and content note for the collection, a basic description of what is inside most of the boxes. Okay. And here's another example. This one is in, this one includes RDA format. And so we have things like the fact that it is text, it's unmediated, and it's in a paper sheet format. This is the same collection with the RDA added to it, with it edited to include RDA formats. Okay. So a question for you here, if we can bring up the poll. Now that you've created that basic bibliographic record, well, what are you going to do with it? Where are you going to publish it? What does your institution currently do? Or if you don't currently create a catalog record, what's your opinion? What's your recommendation? So if we can bring up the poll, we'd like to take a look at that. Okay, wait a few more minutes, or a few more seconds here, and then we'll ask Lisa to share the results with us. Okay, Lisa, are you ready to share those with us?
Yep, just waiting. Oh, here we go. Okay, so local catalog, in-house use only, we have 51%. Online public access catalog is 62%. OCLC 49%. Archives grid 10%, and other is 8%.
All right, excellent. I'd be curious about some of the responses for other, if people want to chat that to us here. All right, so to this point, we've talked about what to do about how to create that basic bibliographic record, that initial catalog record for a manuscript collection. I'd like to just pause for a moment to see if there are any questions or comments to this point, and then what we're going to do is talk a little bit more about how to develop that further. So if anyone has questions about the basic entry, the basic catalog entry, we can talk about those now.
Okay, I'll just jump in to remind everyone that we can use to please type your questions into the question box if you have them. We've actually gotten quite a few questions so far, so just in the interest of time, at this point, I'll just try to ask the ones that are specifically related to the first half of your presentation, and then we can circle back to the other ones at the end.
Okay, sure.
So, the first one I will ask is it standard practice to create the catalog record from information in the completed finding aid?
At this point, we wouldn't have created a finding aid. This is just the very basic initial catalog record that you are creating as it comes in the door or shortly after the collection has come in the door. Talking with some of my archives colleagues, I think it's kind of a mixed bag. Some people just don't do those initial bibliographic records, whether it's for lack of time or lack of resources, or they don't, as an institutional practice, they don't allow access to unprocessed collections, and so they wait until the finding aid is completed to do the catalog record. So it varies from institution to institution.
Okay. How do these unique collections find their way to the Special Collections Department? Are they donated, or does the department contribute in traveling exhibits or collections?
At Stockton, all of our collections are donated. In other places that I've worked before, we have purchased collections. And depending on what the collection is itself, it usually does end up in an exhibit in some format. We usually try to, especially when a collection is fully processed, you try to advertise that it's ready for use. And so we sometimes will do an exhibit, either an online exhibit or an in-house exhibit to advertise that. Does that answer that question?
I think so, but if the person who asked that wants to say either way, I will
Okay.
mention that. I'll say for now that we have one comment and one question, then I'll hand it back over to you.
Okay.
For someone who responded other in that last poll, they said, we don't create the basic bib record, the full one we put in OCLC based on the finding aid.
Okay. Okay.
And then just the last question just for this segment until we come back around to it later. Someone says, I'm new to this. Can you please explain what you mean by finding aid?
I'm going to explain that now. Thank you for the segue. Excellent.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Well, we will come back to the rest of the questions at the end of the webinar.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And thank you so much for your questions so far. I hope that the next part will explain a little bit more, and then we'll answer some more after that. So we've looked at that basic bibliographic entry, and what happens to the collection next? Well, a lot of times, unfortunately, they sit on a shelf for a while. As I mentioned earlier, administrative reasons or lack of staff time, lack of student interest in particular collections. For example, here at Stockton, we use a lot of intern support to help us process collections, and so I give the interns options as to what collection interests them, and sometimes particular collections sit longer than others, unfortunately. So talking a little bit about what happens next, we're talking about processing, and this is the archival word for organizing a collection. When we organize a collection, when we process a collection, we're talking about two different ideas or two different processes here. We're talking about an intellectual arrangement and a physical arrangement of the collection. Intellectual, by that I mean, dividing the collection up how you think it should be organized, not physically, but on paper. So we go through a process where we will divide up a collection into series and sub-series, and these can be things as simple as letters 1999 to 2000, or it can be something more complex like casino revenues in individual casinos in Atlantic City, and then you would use your series and sub-series to kind of divide up the folders. I think a lot of times archivists and catalogers have very similar processes in these kinds of things in the way they think about organizing things, and I think it's a great collaboration opportunity on that too. And then the physical aspect of processing or arranging the materials actually involves going through and putting the materials in the folders, in the acid-free folders inside the acid-free boxes, as well as labeling the folders and actually physically placing the series in the boxes. And then once you've reached that level, sometimes people will go through on an item level basis and remove the staples and the paper clips, those kinds of things, depending on the level of care that's given to the actual items themselves. After this arrangement process is done, and usually during the arrangement process, whoever is doing the arranging will actually take notes and things like that, because all of that information goes into the finding aid. And let's talk about what that is. A finding aid is a guide to the collection. So these are the written descriptions of the collection in a semi-formatted manner, but these are the written descriptions that we provide to our researchers to help them identify if this collection is a good collection for them to use, to help them identify what box, what folder they may want to access. So the finding aid is a guide to the collection. After creating the finding aid, as many of you indicated in the survey, that's when we can go back and actually enhance our bibliographic entry that we did as our basic entry, and enhance it to be able to include more information about what's been discovered during the processing aspect of, or during the time of the processing. So processing includes both arrangement and description, and let's take a look at how the finding aids actually come together after the collection has been arranged. This is an example from the Elizabeth Alton papers. I'm going to link out so that we can see it a little bit more clearly, and we'll take a look at it. Okay. So here, this is a finding aid for the Elizabeth Alton papers. Finding aids are very typically done using a template format so that all of the finding aids in a particular repository or section of a repository are similar. And you'll see what I mean here as we look at this. And you can probably start in your minds to attach MARC fields to some of these different titles that we're going to look at. So we can see here from the Elizabeth Alton papers, the collection title, the collection number, the collection dates, the size or the extent of the collection, the information about the creator and the language, if there are any restrictions to the access, the provenance, where the collection came from, how it got to us, a preferred citation. I always find this very useful to give in a finding aid because special collections are notoriously difficult to cite, and students will typically, or students and faculty and other folks will typically run into problems as they're trying to cite them. So I find that it's easy to give them that citation. We have things like the biographical information about the person or about the topic of the collection. In this case, it's one and the same. And so you'll get a little bit of information that we've gathered about Elizabeth Barstow. We used the actual collections itself to gather some of the information, and then we went and did some research to find information to add to the biographical information. And a scope and content note, a summary of what's inside of the collection. What are the types of things that might be found in a collection? A scope and content note will also point out the geographical area, the time period that the collection covers. It may even cover, or it probably will also point out if there are any gaps in the collection. You know, Elizabeth Alton was on the Board of Trustees here at our university, but she was also instrumental in the Board of Directors of the Miss America pageant and also the New Jersey Federation of Women's Clubs. However, this collection has limited materials that have to do with that. And one of the important points that we point out here too is that although she was on the Board of Trustees at our university, this collection does not have much to do with that. And so we point that out because somebody that's doing research on our beginnings, our university's beginnings, may be misled and think that this collection might have a lot to do with that, and so they might want to know that ahead of time. And then from the process of during the processing from the arrangement of the collection, we make notes about the different series, the different categories that we have divided the collection into. And we do this to explain to the researcher why they are divided up this way. And we also do this to help the researcher to understand our organizational schema so that they can better understand how to use the collection. So all of these are included, as well as subjects, and you'll see that some of these correspond to our MARC 600 fields soon. And we also make a list of things, other collections within special collections that are related to this collection. So if somebody that's doing research can look out and look at the other ones. Another aspect of finding aids that does not translate to the MARC record per se is a contents list, usually a box folder list, however it might be worded in your institution. But you'll get this kind of a listing so that the researcher knows which box to request and what folder within that box might contain the materials that they'll be looking for. And so you'll usually find, as I said, this is kind of a template that we use. All of our finding aids look very similar. And in your institution, you may find something very similar also. And so from this finding aid, it's very easy to create a crosswalk that you can use for your MARC records. So here's an example of a crosswalk that we have created, and I'll show you now how you can apply that to the finding aid. Let me just switch over there. Okay, so taking that same finding aid, you'll see that, of course, the collection title is a 245 MARC field. It's a collection, it's a title. The collection number then can become the 90 or the 99 field, depending on what your institution uses. The collection dates, this is your 264 as well as your fixed field 8. The size, the extent of the collection, this becomes your 300 field. The creator becomes your 100 field or 1XX, I guess, depending on what you might need for a particular collection. Your restrictions to access becomes your 506 field. The preferred citation can become your 524 field. The biographical information becomes your 545 field. Your scoping content note becomes your 520 field. And then your subjects, of course, in your 600s. So this all starts to become, or the finding aid itself starts to become the MARC record. So as we start to look at that MARC record, that initial basic bibliographic record that we created, we can now go back and update our MARC record to improve it a little bit more. At this point in the fixed fields, we would probably change our encoding level to an I, a full level catalog record. And you may need to update your dates fields depending on what materials you found during the process, during processing and during arrangement of the collection, the things that have been discovered and noted in the finding aid. For the variable fields, some of the fields that may need to be updated or edited would include the physical description. Invariably, all the collections get bigger when you're processing them. I don't know how that happens, but they always do seem to get bigger. So, 2 boxes that came to you from the researcher ends up being 4 boxes on the shelf by the time that you've refoldered and reorganized things. The summary, the scope and content note, has probably expanded also. You may have started with an initial description of the collection, correspondence, news clippings, scrapbooks, maybe a date or 2 that you're including in the scope and content. However, at this point, you may be including more information from the finding aid and that more lengthy description. I've seen some places that use an abstract rather than using the scope and content note in their MARC fields, and that's certainly acceptable too. I heard a great description that the abstract for a collection finding aid should be the first sentence of the scope and content note and the first sentence of the bibliographic note. So that's one way of creating it, and maybe an alternate way of using the information in a MARC record. You may need to update your access fields, your 506, if the collection is now open for research because it's been processed. This is a place that you can indicate that. And then your citation field, if that you would want to add that in now that you've got that information. You also add in your biographical notes, your historical note. I give you here 2 examples. One is a biographical note and one is a historical note about an organization. And at this point too, you can advertise the fact that you have a finding aid in the 555. You can also link to it, and that would be done in the 856 field. You can link to the finding aid so that people can click on it and go straight to that finding aid to find more information. And you would, of course, update your 600 fields to include more names and more entities for subject headings. We're going to link out then. Or we'll just take a look at this one right here on OCLC for a second. This is a record using DAX from the Elizabeth Alton papers. This is the first part of it up to the 524 field. You can see that we've added in a longer scope and content note, the citation, and then this is a separate record using RDA and DAX. And in this one, you can see that we have added subject headings down here and included information about the biography. Now you'll see that the biography has been broken across 3 different fields, and that is to preserve the paragraph format in the record itself. If we click to go out to our catalog, you'll see how that displays, and you can see that we have the biographical note here and the scope and content note here. And then you can also find that we have the finding aid available at the library, and you can access the finding aid online down here by clicking on that, and it will take you to our landing page for this particular collection. And what we do on our landing, we use LibGuides, and on our landing page we recreate some of the information from the finding aid, the system of arrangement, the biographical note, the scope and content note, and then we link to the finding aid for the more in-depth information. So that is what the updated, more extensive MARC record might look like after processing. And we've taken this information from the finding aid and crosswalked it over to our MARC record to create the more extensive MARC record. Now, after we have created that MARC record and things like that, as I mentioned, you want to get the word out. You want to let people know that you have this collection available. At this point, you tweet about it, you put out a press release about it, you put it on your website, you let the whole world know, right? And you can link to the MARC record, you can link to the finding aid, however you feel the best way is to get people informed about your collection and get them in the door to research, or on the computer to research if it's an online collection. One of the interesting things that I've been working on lately is that by putting our collections in OCLC, OCLC has been uploading them to this beta archive grid that they've been working on. And so you can actually find the MARC records for collections in archive grid, as well as finding aids of different collections. And this is a service that OCLC has started. You can ask to be included in it. Over here on the website, you can ask to include your collections in archive grid and have your institution listed as one of the institutions that have their collections online. So that's something that you can do with your MARC records in order to get the word out about your collections and to get the word out about your cataloging of these great collections. I will leave you with some resources here. I encourage you to take a look at different records that other people have done and to hopefully apply those. And I certainly hope that this has given you a great, either a great start or a great refresher on how to do MARC records for manuscript collections. Thank you everyone so much. I'll be happy to take some questions now.
Okay, thank you so much, Heather. This has been really interesting and informative. So we now have time for questions. If you have not yet done so, please go ahead and type your questions into the question box. But I will start with some of the ones we already have. Is it okay to create hybrid records using both DAX and RDA elements in a record?
Yes, definitely, yes. DAX is based on AACR2. However, it's very easily updated to include RDA. And as I mentioned, I think SAA, the Society of American Archivists, is RDA neutral. So you are certainly welcome to continue using AACR2 with DAX, or you can update and use RDA with DAX.
Okay. Could you comment on the main differences between RDA and DCRM MSS when we consider item level cataloging, such as in this attendee's case?
When we consider item level cataloging?
Yes.
I don't know that I can. I do not use DCRM and I'm not very familiar with it, so unfortunately I cannot comment on that.
Okay. Someone asks, is it common to list an access finding aid link?
The wording may not be the same in each institution, but I think most institutions, once they have that finding aid available, they will link to it through their MARC record, through the 856 field. They may use different wording, access finding aid or link to finding aid or finding aid, just the word finding aid. But I think most institutions are using links to their finding aids.
Okay. We have a few kind of general questions too. So very broadly, what are some of the issues associated with cataloging today?
Broadly, well, I guess with cataloging manuscripts or just cataloging in general?
I think they're asking about in general, but if you want to limit it to manuscripts or anything that you've maybe particularly encountered recently, then I think that's also helpful.
I guess just speaking to manuscripts, since that's mostly what I do, or that's the crux of what I do. One of the issues that I encounter is that this is not what I do all day, so I don't catalog all day, every day. And so every time that I sit down to catalog, I have to refresh my memory. And that's partially why I created this this worksheet that I'll be sharing with everyone, because I have to kind of remind myself each time I sit down, this is the field I need, or this is the subfield I need to include. And so I find that being a lone arranger, since I don't do this every day, I have to relearn, reteach myself each time I sit down to catalog.
Okay. Do you have any advice for MLS students interested in cataloging?
Ooh, great question. I wish I had taken a cataloging class in library school, and I did not. There was one offered, and I chose to take something else. But I think that any kind of specialized skill, such as cataloging, that might be useful, take advantage, take a class, to do a webinar, take a workshop, something that will give you that skill. And it's certainly a great skill to have in any field, in any of the subfields of library use.
For sure. Okay. When do you use DAX and when do you use I guess you said you don't use DCRM, but
I don't use DCRM, yeah.
Okay. So mostly just DAX and RDA, I think.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. So this is not 100% related to cataloging, but maybe it touches on some of the other areas that you work in. What temperature does the collections department storage room need to be at in order to preserve the artifacts, documents, and other rare and unique materials?
I think the current recommendation is 70 degrees and 50% humidity. Don't ask me what ours is because it's certainly not that. I wish it was. And I have a meeting next week with our facilities department actually. But I think it is 70 and 50% humidity, between 40 and 50% humidity. The key is to get it as stable as possible and not to have spikes in the temperature or the humidity.
Right. Do the special collections use Past Perfect software for cataloging like some museums do?
We do not, but I do know that some do. I have used Past Perfect when I was at the public library. We used it. It's a whole different animal in terms of cataloging. They have the different fields worded differently, but you can do it, and you can import finding aids into Past Perfect also. If the questioner is interested in some guidance on that, I'd be happy to share our guidelines from the Atlantic City Library with that person if they want to contact me afterwards.
Okay, sure, thanks. And what are some tips on determining what collections to accept? This one's kind of going back more to the beginning of your presentation.
Sure. Most archives and special collections will have a collecting policy that, or if you don't, you may want to look into developing one that will give you the guidelines that will tell you, we only accept from this geographical area or on this subject matter. And that's what you use kind of as your comparative or your guidance for as you're looking at a collection. A lot of times you'll be in a situation with a donor where they have some great stuff, but they also have this other stuff that doesn't quite fit your collection, and you either need to be able to diplomatically decline the other stuff, or you're going to end up with a collection that has a combination of both.
Have you cataloged unpublished materials such as letters?
Yes. Yes, we do it more at the collection level. So a collection of letters, we have cataloged those. A collection. I have a collection, I think, of 45 letters that were written to a woman, a poet here in South Jersey, and those are all cataloged as an individual collection, and rather than on the actual item level. However, we're working on scanning each of those letters to put into our online repository. We use Content DM, and in that instance, we would be doing some metadata for each letter, not a full MARC level catalog record, but we use Dublin Core to create individual records for those online records.
Okay, interesting. We have another kind of more general sort of workflow type question that's asking about what kind of storage containments are used for the items that you're cataloging, such as are they in cardboard boxes or kind of just on a shelf?
Usually when they come to us, they're in cardboard boxes. Actually, I've gotten a couple lately that are in those big Rubbermaid tubs. But when we do go through processing, that's when we transfer them to the acid-free folders, the acid-free boxes, the kinds of materials that are going to help it or help preserve the materials and help them to last longer.
Okay, thank you. All right, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. This one is, how does the museum's collection department differ from library special collections, if you can comment at all on that?
It depends on the institution. So for example, at the Atlantic City Library, we also ran the Atlantic City Historical Museum, and that is when we started using Past Perfect. And so museum level cataloging is significantly different because you do look at things on the item level. You are painting the accession numbers onto things or writing them onto things, and then you're cataloging each object or each individual part of an object. Even you catalog the shoelaces separate from the shoe. And so it's much more detailed, whereas when we're talking about archives collections and cataloging archives collections, we're looking at things as a whole. We're looking at groupings of materials. We're looking at things that have all come from one donor that are going to all be considered together. And the idea is that by considering them together, the researcher can better understand the person that created the records. So the context and the provenance help the researcher to understand why the records were created and why they were kept together by considering them together as a whole that way.
Okay, thank you. And we'll just do one last question here, which is, Do you prefer to keep everything in a collection together, or do you sometimes remove certain things to catalog them separately?
Great question. I prefer to keep things together, but with the asterisk there, right? We do separate out published monographs sometimes from our collection, and we make a note in the catalog record itself indicating that it came from this particular collection, and we'll usually put a sheet of paper in with the collection also. So for example, there's a collection that just came in that has a lot of Atlantic City, New Jersey brochures in the collection. The brochures will probably be staying in with the collection. However, there's also a number of booklets that were published by the tourism agency, and those will be pulled out and cataloged separately because of the types of material that's in them, and we feel like people need access to that separately. But we'll put a sheet of paper in with the collection indicating that the booklet is, you know, at such and such call number on the shelf, so that we can have access to it that way if somebody's looking at the collection and they want to look at it that way too.
Okay, great, thank you. And thank you everyone for your questions. I believe we got through everything, but just in case there were any that I missed, Heather has kindly offered to answer them in writing. So if there are any others, we will send those out via email.
Great, thank you everyone. I enjoyed being with you today.
Okay, I just have some last final logistics. Okay, we are glad that you could be with us today. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions. Your comments are very valuable and help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan future events. The email will also include links to today's slides and recording. You now also have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance, and that information will also be in the email. So thank you once again to our presenter, Heather Perez, and thanks also to members of the Continuing Education Committee, Catherine Balick, Felicity Dykus, and Miriam Nauenberg, and to Alana Warren from the ALCTS office. The support they provide make it possible for us to present these webinars. ALCTS has other continuing education events coming up. Please see the ALCTS website to register or find more information on any of these upcoming webinars. And ALCTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. Our next e-forum will be on November 13th, discussing ebook management. Please check the website for information on upcoming courses and discussions. Thank you all for joining us today. This concludes our session.